You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Back with me and Emily, of course, and we are still in the book of Judges, but we are moving on from Gideon and his descendants. We're going to catch up with a couple footnotes, and not literal footnotes, but a couple very briefly mentioned people, and then we're going to move on to the story of Jephthah. No, not Japheth. That's Noah's son.
Right.
Jephthah, which I'm sure lots of people are going to be really interested, if you're familiar with this story, to hear all the craziness that it ensues. So
oh yeah,
I'm excited to get into this one because it is, one, it's very controversial and in itself, just as a story.
Mm-hmm.
But two, it's got a lot of very interesting details that put it to the whenever you put them back in their right context, make the story make a lot more sense.
Oh yeah. Well, and this is, like you said, one of the most hotly debated stories. And there's so many ways that we can go with how to interpret it. So we aren't even going to get to the good part this week. That doesn't mean turn us off. Just keep listening, because it's going to be.
You'll need this to understand the rest of it.
Exactly. So
we promise.
Yeah. No pressure. But before we get to him, we're actually going to talk about Tola and Jair. They're mentioned in the first two verses of, is it the two verses?
They got first 5 verses.
They got 5 verses.
5 whole verses, not even, it's maybe just slightly under a quarter of the chapter.
So we got these 2 judges, and they don't have much said about them, especially when you compare them to Gideon and Samson and even Abimelech. We don't have any details about their life. There's no military actions recorded. There's no mention of God's activity during their time. Basically, all we know about Tola is that he judged Israel for 23 years. Mm-hmm. He's a man of Issachar. He lives in Ephraim, and he's buried in, I can't read my writing here, Shemaiah?
Shamir.
Okay, Shamir. That's an R, not an A.
The Bible's easier to read.
Most usually.
They print it in better font than your handwriting.
Right. So his name means worm. Once again, what are biblical parents thinking? The only 2 personal details we really have about him is he's the son of Pua and the son of Dodo. We don't know who they are. They probably had some significance to the original audience. That significance has been lost to us. But that's it. He evidently did okay because there wasn't much of a critique. And then the second judge in this part is Jair, and he has 30 sons who ride on 30 donkeys, and they have 30 cities. He's judged for 23 years. He's from Gilead. Again, no real personal details offered with him, and we don't really have any kind of background. It's just these 2 guys that, hey, they were judges,
right? So interestingly enough, he said he was the first judge. He said he was
Tola,
buried in Shamir. So I was curious about what that meant, and it apparently means it. I saw here, it looks like it means worm as well.
Oh, okay.
But also, it looks like there's a type of tool called worm, which is for splitting stone.
That's interesting.
So it's not just like
it's not like an earthworm I'm going to put on my fishing hook.
Right. Yeah, it's a little different than what we have there.
That makes more sense. There's not a whole lot to say about these guys because the writer of Judges didn't give us a lot to say. We can read some things into it. Evidently, there was a certain amount of peace and prosperity if Jair had 30 sons with 30 donkeys and 30 cities. So that's a little different than what we've seen before. The writer of Judges also uses that reversal thing that we've seen over and over again in the book, that, Tola is important because of who his father was.
Mm-hmm.
Jair is important because of who he fathered.
Right.
So now, what kind of teaching points you want to draw out of that? If you got suggestions, I'm open to them.
Right. Yeah, there's not a whole lot really. I mean, if there's anything to be learned here, yeah, let us know, because we're kind of at a loss here. Other than, I mean, the only thing I can think is that it, just kind of like the, who are they? The Bereans mentioned in Acts, it says they're very righteous and there's not much you hear about them. They're better than the Thessalonians. But even those in the Thessalonica still have 2 books worth of material dedicated towards correcting them about some things. So it's kind of the less you hear about some people, the better.
Yeah, so maybe we learn more from the screw-ups than we do from the people who get it right.
Well, actually there is, there's kind of a school of thought in lots of, I've heard this in so many different areas, that you do learn more from your mistakes than, if you go out and play a perfect game,
mm-hmm.
In sports, or if you go out and do a perfect performance, you're not learning anything necessarily in those situations. But if you can learn how to correct a mistake, you're actually growing in your art or
mm-hmm.
your skill. So, there is that aspect of it, because I know that for me, I'm a guitar player,
mm-hmm.
and I know that for me, it's hard. Like, I hear rhythms, but I just hear what they are and just repeat them in the action. But it's hard for me to count them, because I don't necessarily just break a rhythm down. I can just recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like it drives my wife nuts, who is a classically trained musician, whenever I'm trying to teach her a strum pattern or something, because it's very hard for me to just break it down into a 1E Andy, 2E Andy, or something like that. So
this makes me feel better about the time you tried to teach me how to play guitar.
Yeah. So it's hard to explain, and it actually, it has given me some difficulty in learning some more difficult rhythm patterns, because when it takes me longer to break them down
mm-hmm.
and then reassemble them. So I'm not saying I'm a fantastic musician or anything, but
there is that, the difference between innate talent, which, I think you were born with a lot of that, because you can play pretty much anything you want to. Whereas I can play nothing except for the radio. And that's, there's a difference between a musician who works for it versus a musician who is born with it.
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
There just is that distinction. And, it's not just music. We have an aunt who is phenomenal with mathematics
mm-hmm.
and numbers and arithmetic and everything, all that makes sense to her.
Yep.
And trying to get her to explain how she goes through the process sometimes is difficult, because it's just so fast in her brain.
Yeah. So I don't know if that is the point, but there's,
yeah,
that's kind of a speculation.
Have fun with that.
Fun thing, yeah. It's talking about, yeah. And that reminds me, actually, I do want to share this tweet that I saw earlier today. Face ID doesn't work if I'm behind a pop filter, apparently. Your friend Tim Fall, he tweeted, we're talking about, like, the less that's said, the better off the
right.
situation. He was responding to someone posting that it was a slow news day, and Tim says, "I feel like this should be a call and response." The leader says, "Slow news day." The congregation would say, "Let us give thanks."
Exactly.
So, that's kind of
exactly. You got to love Tim. He's got a way with words.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, if you're not following Tim Fall on Twitter, go check him out.
Absolutely.
We'll post a link to his Twitter in the show notes.
Yeah, shout out to Tim. I'll have to let him know that we talked about him. So
I'm sure he'll love that.
Yeah, he will. So okay, so we're back in Judges, which is actually fitting, because speaking of Tim, so Tim,
because Tim is a judge. You have to. No one else is going to get that.
Oh,
so.
Yeah, but he's going to love it. So
okay.
So ahead. Anyway, so we're in Judges 10, verses 6 through 18. And you aren't going to have this in your Bible, like on a heading or anything, but this is the beginning of Jephthah's story. And the reason why it's the beginning of Jephthah's story is because Jephthah's story is going to mirror Gideon's stories in a lot of ways. And it's going to mirror Abimelech's story in a lot of ways. And what the writer is trying to do is point out that these events, these sinful events that bring bad consequences, they're not one-offs. They are entrenched ways of and methods of behavior within the culture. And so we keep seeing these repeated themes because we need to see that this is repetitive, entrenched sin that the nation is engaged in.
Mhm.
So just like Gideon's story begins with the prophet showing up, and we discussed, the significance of his appearance, Jephthah's story is beginning with this confrontation with God and Israel. And what's going to happen is God's basically confronting Israel about the gods that they have served. And he lists off 7 different gods. And he lists the Baal, the Asherahs, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And each of these have points of connection back to previous stories, or at least the first 5 do. So basically we get the gods of Canaan with the Baals and the Asherah.
Mm-hmm.
King Aram was the king who oppressed the people during the time of Othniel. That was our first judge back in Judges 3. Moab is the one who was oppressing the people under Ehud. And again, back in Judges 3, that's the latter part of that chapter. Sidon is referred to in Judges chapter 1, verses 31, as the people that Asher did not drive out. Mm-hmm. And so these first 5, they draw attention to the fact that not only had the people served these gods, that these were the gods of the people who had oppressed them, that they had accepted the rule of not just the kings of these foreign lands, but the gods who had sponsored the kings of these foreign lands. Mm-hmm. And so God's basically saying, you were so messed up. You have some severe problems if this is the God you want to serve instead of me.
Kind of like a divine Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't put that term to it, but yes. So, but they've got problems. I mean, and we do see this where the idea that the one who oppresses you is the one that you respect. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that's part of human nature, that if someone has a greater level of power, that there's a certain amount of respect. It may not be healthy,
right?
But we see this a lot in the clans and tribal warfare throughout all countries and cultures, where you did rule by the ability to overthrow and oppress. Mm-hmm. So now, the last 2 gods on this list, the Ammonites and the Philistines, these are actually going to be the gods that show up with Jephthah's story and Samson's story. So you have this looking back, but then you have this hint at the future.
Okay.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah. So God's omniscient, and that's being pointed out in the words of this prophet. And the list also corresponds perfectly with Deuteronomy 7. And so we have the same list of nations, and these are the nations that are supposed to be driven out. These are the children of the Rephaim and the Nephilim and the giants. And I think we forget sometimes that these are still giants. And
right. Well, and we also kind of have this, I specifically told you.
Right.
It's like, it's whenever,
you can't claim ignorance.
If you're a parent, you know this, when you tell your child to do something or not to do something, small example, don't jump on me when don't jump off the arm of the chair onto my belly. It hurts.
Right.
Don't do it. And, they do it 3 minutes later, and you get mad at them, and they're going, what?
They're crushed.
What I do? And you're like, no, I specifically just told you not to do this thing.
Right.
And you just did the thing. So that's
well, again, we've kind of referenced it before. Judges really is they've been acting like that rebellious teenager. The people of Judges at that point, they're acting like that immature child that's still testing the limits. And we're seeing once again, just like we talked about with Abimelech, they have become so Canaanized. They're so much like the people they were supposed to get out of there, that it's starting to be difficult to tell the difference. But the big problem, and this is in that prophet's decree, is that they forsook and abandoned Yahweh. and they were not serving him. And now, what you need to remember in this culture, it's not unusual to serve several different gods. You
Right.
can serve a familial god, an ancestral god that's been attached to your tribe or clan, along with the god of that land. That would have been normal. For ancients, this was not an either or equation.
Well, it would make sense though in a polytheistic society to serve other gods because they
Cover
don't
all
have,
your bases.
They don't have an almighty God.
Right.
They don't have the God who created the whole earth. They have gods who work in certain regions. They have gods who work on certain projects. You know, you've got a weather god and work on certain projects. Sorry, it just sounded funny when as it came out of my mouth. But you know, you've got the god of the birds and the god of the sea. You've got the god of the sun, the god of the moon, and so, you know, you're going to have to worship all these different gods if you want everything to work together the way it's supposed to. And so, you know, we've kind of got that covered with one god and going, no, this one actually runs all of this stuff. So I don't have to worry about, you know, oh, did I pray to the rain god to get enough crops, or did I pray to did I pray to the sun god to make sure that we'd get enough sunshine to grow the crops? Did I, just things like that. Did we pray to the god of healing enough? Are we going to get a plague? There
wasn't one god who covered it all.
Yeah, and so
so you had to cover it all.
Yeah, it would make sense if your view of God is too small. Then yeah, you're going to need more gods or other things to prop up God.
Yeah,
I think that's a good illustration there.
Well, and the thing is, because that was so common, they were actually having to go out of their way to reject Yahweh. So this isn't just, hey, we brought other gods to worship alongside of you. We're actually going out of our way to exclude you. That's kind of the final straw that breaks the god's back. It kind of leads to this whole situation where God's having this very emotional response to what's going on. And so,
and it goes back to, like we said earlier in the study, is, this was not an accident.
Right.
Because, we talked about the king who built the altar with his own hands. And, so that, or let's say the king, but whoever it was who was in charge of stuff, who built the altar with his own hands. And, and if you've done any kind of building projects, I've done woodworking. I can't imagine working with stone and carving at the time, trying to build this stuff. So, it's time and it's effort.
Right. Yeah, you just slipped on a banana peel. Oops, I'm worshiping Baal now.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. Yeah. So, and so it makes sense that God, in verse 7, God is angry and he sells the people into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. He's got two oppressors, and he's going to allow the people to be crushed and oppressed for 18 years. And we're told the geography. We have Gilead, which is east of Jordan, and we have Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. And this is really the heart of Israel as a nation. Jephthah, who's coming up, he's going to be from Gilead, and Samson is from Zorah, which is about 18 miles west of Israel in that second geographic location mentioned. So again, God is omniscient. He's not only dealing with the sins that have happened, he's already got his eyes on the sins that are going to happen. And we need to remember that. Verse 9, I thought this was interesting. Israel was severely distressed. This has got to be the understatement of the year. Because when you go back to Gideon's story, they're already living in caves trying to get away from the Moabites. So how bad are things now? It makes you wonder what's going on that they're severely distressed.
Violence, and much of it.
Yeah. No. Well, and the thing is, when you read this, the emphasis in this passage really is on God's response to the people. It's not really about what the people are doing so much as, yes, we're told what the people are doing, but we're told what God is thinking and feeling about what the people are doing. And so the people cry out, verse 10. This is the only time that we're told specifically what they cry out. And they say, we have sinned against you. because we have forsaken our God and served Baals. Now, on the surface, this seems like a positive step, but God's response seems to suggest that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got to keep reading. And so verses 11 through 14, we've got 7 times that God saves Israel listed. There's 7 deliverances. We've got the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Moabites.
Okay.
Now, in the Septuagint, it's Midianites. We don't know who the Moabites are. So that's a really interesting question that I'm not going to get into because it's kind of beside the point of the overall theme. So we have 7 betrayals. We have 7 nations and 7 deliverances.
Okay.
So we got the symbolic use of 7. We talked about this some last episode. 7 means completion. This is the totality. This is not supposed to be an exhaustive list of everything God has done for Israel or everything God will do for Israel. He's just saying, I have totally and completely saved you over and over again from every enemy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you still aren't where you need to be. And so in verse 14, I love God's response. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in the time of distress.
Mm-hmm.
Echoes of Gideon's dad.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, and we see that too, and we see that, and then we see that with well, I think we've mentioned this before with Elijah,
Mhm.
and with
Mount Carmel.
with the prophets of Baal, and he's going, if whoever's God is going to have to show himself to be God and
Mm-hmm.
serve the one that actually can save.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. God sees right through what they're doing. And, let's just be real. Worshiping Baal was a lot more fun than worshiping Yahweh. We got to have wild parties. There were orgies. There was lots of drinking. It was just the epitome of every college student's good time. And so, yeah, it made sense that this would appeal to them. And God's like, if that's what you want, you can have it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And throughout the Bible, I think it's one of the things we see over and over again. God says, if this is really what you want, you get to have it. But there's going to be consequences. And what I think is interesting in this scenario, the people aren't being chastised for a lack of faith.
Right.
They're being chastised for not being faithful because they never lose faith. Every time there's a problem, they don't go to the Baals and the other gods. Mm-hmm. They always come back to Yahweh because they know he is the only one who's going to save them.
Yeah, yeah.
They want the fun stuff that goes with all the other gods. They don't, and this is what it boils down to, they don't want to obey. They have no desire to obey. They just want the privileges. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's a sermon in there somewhere that that I'm going to try to keep myself from preaching.
Stick to the text. Stick to the text.
Okay. Well, I am. So here's the text I'm going to bring in just to kind of prove my point just a little bit. Jeremiah 7 verses 21 through 23. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifice, eat the flesh, for in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to your fathers or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices, but this command I gave them, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in the way that I command you, that it may be well with you. Mm-hmm. So God's saying obedience is what brings blessing, not faith in this situation. I mean, I think faith is a component, but he's saying obedience is what's going to mark you as my people. Mm-hmm. And this is what's going to bring prosperity, at least in Canaan, whenever they come into that land. So, we need to be careful not to go too far with the prosperity gospel thing, because we aren't going to manipulate God into giving us things that just doesn't work. We can't bribe him, which, by the way, this account's actually going to demonstrate. But there is blessing in obedience. And I think the Bible is very clear about that. And the thing is, obedience is not supposed to be a cold observance of the law. It's supposed to be the expression of that relationship and the desire to protect and maintain that relationship. And I think that this is one of those stories. I was surprised at how relational Jeff, the story becomes, and it's okay. It's just cool. We're going to keep going.
So where we go next?
Okay. So the discipline, okay, I started to read my notes there, but I don't need to because I already said that because I'm ahead of myself. So, but what I want to do is I want to transpose this kind of exchange that's going on into a relationship scenario that I think that a lot of us can identify with. If you read what the people are saying and you kind of look at it from the view of a marriage relationship, their speech back to God is very much the one of an abuser. Honey, I'm sorry. Honey, I've changed my ways. If you love me, you'll let me. Don't be mad. Here's a present. Because the people put aside their other gods and they worship Yahweh for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's actually kind of funny because you and I have had a conversation similar to that about how, and I'm going to probably make some people mad here, but we really do kind of mirror that every Sunday, some of us, and myself included probably, where you just, you are, you don't live the way you're supposed to all week, and then you go back and you, God, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. Please forgive me.
I'm going to placate. I'm going to smooth things over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, we've had that conversation regarding modern church worship and certain worship songs that we've seen and some of the ways that people are led in the worship services, but I'm not going to go too much deeper into that. I think, but
we've demonstrated your views on that before.
I think we've talked about that a little bit. So go ahead.
But yeah, well, I mean, the whole thing, it's basically this idea that, they're telling God what they think he wants to hear. And even though the language seems to demonstrate some repentance, God in his omniscience, he's not accepting it as repentance. As a matter of fact, the word repentance isn't even used. It's almost this lip service kind of event going on because there's no real change of heart. And remember, in the past, throughout Judges, crying out has never equaled repentance. Not once in the book of Judges. Even the putting away the other gods feels more like a manipulation. Matter of fact, when I read this, one of the things that sprung to mind was, my ex-husband way back when, every time he got caught with pornography, would put it away. Mm-hmm. But then what happens the first time my back is turned? It's right back. So it feels like a manipulation. And, I could admit I might be bringing my own baggage to this text. But on the flip side, maybe my experience has given me a little insight into what's going on here. So I
don't think you're bringing your own baggage to the text and you may be, who knows, but
right.
But I think given the language that God uses here, it's pretty clear. And especially when you look at the way that Baal worship was occurring.
Yeah. With all the sexual rituals. Mm-hmm. And I think we forget that this is part of the reason why sexual purity is so big in the Bible, because it was that abuse of the gift of sexuality.
Let's use sexual ethic. I hate to use purity in that context because it has been so abused.
It has been, and there's a lot of baggage. But there's this the abuse of sexuality for the worship of these other gods, and particularly when you factor in Genesis 6 and the horrific events that happened there, and then when you start to look at the Canaanite culture like we do with Abimelech, you begin to see why the abuse of sexuality is such a huge issue within Judaism and Christianity. This is not something that God's just, don't want you to have any fun. There is a theological reason for it. So in verse 16, one of the phrases there is, he became impatient over the misery of Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a weird wording. The words there can mean angry, exasperated. He couldn't tolerate, frustrated. Literally, it says his soul was short.
Okay.
And which you got to love the Hebrew and the picture it paints. But I was amazed at how many commentators really felt like they couldn't get a grasp on this. And there's so much back and forth debate on what it should mean. It was funny because, I've been using Webb and Block as my commentaries on this
passage.
Yeah. And like Webb and Block were talking to each other in the commentaries and quoting each other. And so, so basically Webb and Raddick was a rabbi, said that this was a statement that God will relent and that he will help them, but he's losing his desire to help them. Okay. Block sees this as a total dismissal of Israel, that God in his frustration is just like, go do your thing. I'm not even going to mess with you.
Right.
They all pretty much agree that the people of Israel are being insincere and manipulative, and God's seeing this. But I think if you put this into the framework of that abusive relationship, what you see is this is God's getting tired of seeing Israel hurt herself.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Because, what do you feel? If you're in that abusive relationship and you're watching that spouse, that loved one, do these things, you feel frustrated, exasperated, you feel angry, hurt, betrayed, all the things that having a short soul lead to. So I read this as not as a statement of intent, which I think that's what Block and Webb and all the rabbis were trying to get out of it.
Right.
I read this as an expression of God's emotional response to the actions.
Right.
So, and in that emotional state, God is drawing back from them. And that sounds horrific because we're told, God's always supposed to be there. He's always supposed to be on your side. And he is. I'm not discounting that. But in a human relationship, once again, putting it in that context, we call this setting healthy boundaries. It's not wrong for God to say, you are taking advantage of your status as my bride, as the one that I've loved and called out of Egypt. And I'm not going to let you do this.
Right.
And we can't say that's wrong for God to do if we're saying, every counselor out there is going to tell you that's one of the first things you need to do.
It's set a boundary.
Set a healthy boundary.
And that goes, and that's not just not just in abusive relationships. You got to have healthy boundaries wherever you are.
Right. And suddenly I'm looking at my notes and trying to figure out what we're doing. Okay. I know where we are now.
Okay.
So this is
Book of Judges.
Yeah. Well, this is setting us up for Jephthah, as we said. And what we're going to notice as we move forward, God's drawn back. He set that boundary. So as we read through Jephthah's account, what we're getting is God is not raising him up. God is never mentioned in his rise to leadership.
Right.
He's completely silent. And the only time that God's spirit is with this particular judge is when it's during the actual time of battle.
Okay.
So there's going to be some interesting parallels that are going to come out. So verse 17 and 18, the Ammonites, they assemble for war, and they're assembling in Gilead. And so quick summary, the leaders of Gilead realize that they need a leader. But instead of going to God and inquiring, who should it be? Can you help us? They began looking for somebody themselves.
Okay.
And this is kind of where the political situation is when Jephthah arrives on the scene. So now we're moving into chapter 11.
Gotcha.
So
this is where Jephthah actually gets there.
Yes, this is where we actually see this name for the first time. And we're introduced to him in verses 1 through 3. We know he's from Gilead. His father's a Gileadite. Matter of fact, his name is actually Gilead. So probably this text says that. Whether it actually was or not, that's a matter of debate. We've talked about names and how they're used before.
Right.
He's a mighty warrior. So again, connected back to Gideon. But his mother is a prostitute, a Zona, not a Kadesha. A Zona just means she was in business.
Okay.
She's not a sacred or a temple prostitute.
Fair enough. I was about to ask what the difference was. I know we've covered it before,
Yeah.
but I just want to make sure we're clear for this episode.
Right. And so now there's some dispute. Even the rabbis debated this. the rabbi said that this is not necessarily a word for prostitute. It could just mean a strange or foreign woman.
Okay.
It can, in Hebrew, the word can have something to do with dealings with foreign gods or nations or people. It can also just mean to commit fornication. So she may not have actually been his wife. She may have just been a woman that he had an affair with. It also
it just means not a wife.
Yeah, pretty much. And so if you look at Abimelech's mother was a concubine.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is even a step down from that. And so we really don't know who she was, but the main thing, what this word does tell us, she could have, there's a couple of possibilities. She could have been a woman that an Israelite father sold into prostitution.
Okay.
So there's a violation of Leviticus 19:29, not supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Daddies are supposed to take care of their daughters. She could have been a Canaanite woman, which would have been a violation of Deuteronomy 7:1-5.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, somebody's sinning here.
Right.
The only reason why this man exists is because of sin. And in engaging in this kind of sin, what we got to remember is not only are people being disobedient to God, they're endorsing practices of the Canaanites.
Right.
They're saying that the Canaanite practices are superior to what God has demanded of them. But the main thing here is that this is pointing to when there's a son of a different wife, a woman who's not, or a different woman, that the son is not being considered equal to the other sons.
He's not considered a full member of the family.
Yeah. So Gilead's sons, they drive Jephthah out because they didn't want to share the inheritance. And we have massive transgressions, violations of the Torah. Deuteronomy 10:12-22 commands the Israelites to care for the outcast.
Mm-hmm.
So he should have been the first one that they cared for. Leviticus 19:33-34 commands us to love one's neighbor as themselves. And this, how much more for a brother.
Mm-hmm.
So under the simplest reading of the hereditary laws, Jephthah should have been included because hereditary rights were determined by the father, not the mother.
Right.
So the brothers, at this time, it's the brothers who are out of line, not the outsider.
Okay.
So again,
yeah, because I guess we do see that with the sons of Israel.
Well, go back to Gideon's story. Abimelech was the outsider, and he was wrong.
Yep.
So the writer of Judges, the way he's putting these stories together, you keep seeing everything keeps getting flipped and twirled and spun, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. It's really very well written.
Yeah.
So
doesn't matter who it is, somebody's screwing up something. It's basically what the writer's telling us.
Yeah, pretty much. So when he's driven out, he goes to the city called Tov, which is kind of funny because immediately he surrounds himself with worthless fellows, is how it's translated. Again, not the
sons of Belial.
Yeah.
Actually worthless fellows.
Actually worthless fellows, but connecting us back to Abimelech, who hired the worthless fellows. And Webb, actually, he translated this as outcast. Less evil, but just not the most desirable people to have in your life.
Fair enough.
And so the idea that this place kind of served as a gathering point for those who weren't a part of the society as a whole. And so verses 4 and 5, sometime after the Ammonites attack, and no one volunteers to defend or to assemble an army to lead. And the leaders of Gilead, they go to Jephthah and they say, hey, we want you to come lead us and to fight against the Ammonites.
Yeah. And again, bringing in someone, and I think, again, we're bringing in that idea of Abimelech.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing in the outsider to take care of business.
Right.
So that, yeah.
So
I'm with you.
Okay, so and the Hebrew is really specific here. At this point, what they want a military leader. They are not looking for somebody to govern the nation. They aren't looking for somebody to be a king. They've already been through that. They know that it doesn't work. So they go to Jephthah and they say, "Hey, come help us defend ourselves." And in verse 7, it's very interesting. He says, "Do you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" Now, some of the things going on here. Jephthah seems to be identifying the elders of Gilead as his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So we have questions. Are they literally his brothers?
Or is it more of a...
They're complicit.
Yeah. Well, or use like that in the political speech. We're all brothers of this city or this nation. Or one quick question that I had. Are we supposed to be also seeing, and the answer I'm going to guess is probably close to a yes, but are we supposed to be seeing parallels between Jephthah, Abimelech, and David in the gathering of the people? Because you have in Samuel 22, 22 verse 2.
First or second Samuel?
First. And it says, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became a commander over them. And they were with him for about 400 men.
That's interesting.
So I was wondering if we're supposed to be seeing that, because you also have David, who's not looked for as the leader by his brothers and his father,
the youngest.
And so I kind of wonder if there's kind of this parallel there that we see with these people setting themselves up in the in everything, and maybe to be a contrast of these counterfeit kings that came before.
It's kind of interesting because I was actually thinking along the lines of a lot of the people that Jesus interacted with were the outsiders and the outcast, and the largest population for a long time among early Christians were women and slaves. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't have that full standing in society. Mm-hmm. So I think there's two ways to read it. The very cynical way to read it would be that those who are dissatisfied with the status quo are the first to gravitate to a revolutionary kind of leader. Mm-hmm. But then there is the idea that in God's compassion, he sends leaders who will minister even to those who are broken. Mm-hmm. So I guess, a probably lesson to be pulled out of that would be you've got to find that balance. I mean, are you looking for people who are genuinely hurt and in need of compassion, or are you looking at people who are just angry and embittered at the system?
Right.
I think when you are genuinely hurt, sometimes it is easy to become embittered with the system. So, finding the discernment and wisdom to figure out where that balance is, maybe that's the sign of a good leader.
Right.
Because, was David right in what he did? I honestly, I'm not real familiar with that story, so I'm going to have to go back and study it. So I don't want to make a call on that.
But I was just happening to think of that. If we do get into Samuel, we might dig more into that connection and see if there's anything there.
I wouldn't be surprised. And the thing is, once again, it could be a polemic because so often with these stories where there is that reversal where David is the God appointed king, it could be the foil to Jephthah and his worthless men.
Sure.
So, and the distressed men. But in this speech between the brothers, kind of what I'm picking up on, I kind of think it really was his brothers because there's no denial.
Right.
And there tends to be, if they weren't directly involved in casting him out, why didn't they it wasn't us. Mm-hmm. That tends to be human nature. I want to distance myself from that unsavory situation.
Yep.
And so, but the other thing that really stood out to me is his words echo God's words. why are you here? You're upset. You're in great distress. Why did you come looking for me? Didn't you have someone else you could have chosen?
Right.
Gods, you go to the gods you chose. Stick with them. Let them fight for you. Jephthah, stay with the people you chose because you didn't choose me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so there's this, begins to be this really interesting play and contrast between God's response and Jephthah's response. And so the people, they approach both God and Jephthah in a similar manner. And we've got, again, that time of distress. And both of them want God and Jephthah to save them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, God sets that boundary, but Jephthah, he takes advantage of this. In verse 9, he demands more. He's not willing just to be their pawn. He demands that they give him, they let him be the head.
Mm-hmm.
That they let him rule over them. And he puts a condition on it. If God's, gives the Ammonites into my hand, then I want to be your ruler. I want to be your king. And he does invoke the name of God. Doesn't seem to be, a very pious act.
Probably more formality than anything.
Oh yeah. And the elders respond, oh yeah, absolutely. We're going to make this vow and we're going to invoke the name of God too. And Jephthah, he and the elders return to Mizpah, and the people are so excited when they get there. They don't even wait for him to win. They automatically declare that he's going to rule over them. He's going to be their military leader, and he's going to be the head of the nation. And the verse says he spoke all these words before the Lord at Mizpah.
Okay.
So it's a really weird event going on here because there's no formalized ceremony. It's just kind of this spontaneous proclamation. Mizpah isn't a sacred place. And typically when you enthroned a king at this point, you wanted it to be done in a sacred location.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the flavor of a sacred ceremony, even without all the trappings. And, really his rise to power should have been conditional at this point, but the people don't seem to care.
Yeah. Well, it actually, and I know I'm not sure if there is a parallel, but it kind of reminds me of when God says, basically says, will you follow me? Will you obey me and follow my laws? And they're like, well, what are your laws? They're like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's
I don't need to know more.
Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of that, just kind of that attitude of like, yeah, we'll go ahead and sign up for this, even though we don't know what's going to happen.
Well, and that's the whole thing. There's a ton of parallels between Jephthah's relationship with the Gileadites. It's a fun word to try to say, and God's relationship with Israel. And because, okay, so just to point it, make it very pointed, they're both rejected by their families.
Mm-hmm.
Israel is God's family.
Right.
And so they're both in that time of distress. They both are seeking help from the one they rejected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And at first, both of them, Jephthah and God, reject the appeal for help.
Right.
You didn't want me. I don't need to help you. The Israelites and Jephthah's brothers make apologies for rejecting them and use that very manipulative language. God totally rejects the apology, and Jephthah seems to accept it. Okay. And he seems to, okay, I get it. But at the same time, they both see through it. It's like, I know what you're doing here.
But we'll play along.
We'll play along.
Because it does kind of get me something of what I want.
Exactly. And, in Israel, when God rejects the apology, they reinstate his worship. When Jephthah first makes that refusal, they come back with, we'll even make you the leader. We're okay with putting someone we hated over us if you'll just accept our apology. It'll be okay. And then this is where we start to see the contrast, because God, he's frustrated and hurt over what's going on. Jephthah uses it to his advantage. He's
Right.
willing to take advantage of that emotional chaos that's going on and that great need. He doesn't have compassion or empathy with them. He's seeing this as an opportunity.
Right.
And so you have these almost two identical situations going on with the two main characters of this part of Judges. And you have one who truly loves Israel, who sets that boundary and says, I'm going to let you work it out, and you need to grow up and you need to figure out what's good for you. And then you've got Jephthah who says, hey, I'm going to exploit everything for my own benefit. And so you really do get to see that contrast between true love and what appears to be love. And Jephthah, he knows what's going on. He's not stupid, and we're going to see this in the story. He's got some ability and some smarts about him.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
it says he's a mighty warrior.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and the thing is, he's willing to participate in this very dysfunctional relationship if it means getting what he wants. And I think that's the big distinction. And I think when we read this, we're supposed to see that there is this, God's not going to be manipulated into participating in a relationship that's not only not good for him,
mm-hmm.
it's not good for Israel.
Right.
Jephthah, he's the antithesis of this. And I think what we're seeing is we're moving Israel out of that rebellious teenage phase that we saw with Gideon and everything, and we are moving it more into that marital kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we see that shift, and we kind of start to see these things within the marriage relationship, what we see from Jephthah, we see somebody who's willing to be in a codependent relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And if, I've been there, I've gone through all this, and if you guys want more history on that, then Scandalous, you can find it on Amazon. I talk about it there. But when you're in that codependent relationship, one of the things that you really derive your sense of identity and value over being useful.
Mm-hmm.
God says, my identity is not bound up in being useful. Mm-hmm. My worth and my worthiness of being worshipped isn't dependent on being useful.
Right.
Jephthah is willing to accept manipulation as love. And God's like, no, I see it for what it is. I will not be manipulated. You don't get to buy me off. And a lot of times when you're in that abusive relationship, the first thing you want that payoff, because it is cyclical. You do get that buy off. You get that high of a wonderful few days or months, wherever you are in that cycle. And that manipulation is close enough to love that you're willing to accept it.
Right.
But
I kind of follow what you're saying there.
Well, and the final thing that is so big, and most people who are in those codependent relationships don't want to admit this, and this is a hard one, and one that I had to work with, is we think we're the saviors. We're
Right.
the ones who are going to fix them. We're the ones who are going to make everything all right for them. Another way of saying this, we think we're God.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though we're the ones being abused, we're doing it out of a sense of pride and arrogance that says, if I just do this right the next time, I can make everything better. And what I love about the story is God demonstrates, if you're the one being abused in a relationship, this is the proper response. You set that boundary. You recognize the lies and the manipulation for what they are. You draw back, not to be cruel,
Right.
but because they have made a choice and you need to respect that choice. And so, so often in today's world, when, God doesn't immediately answer a prayer to fix something, critics of God are willing to say, oh, well, see, he's powerless. He really doesn't care. He doesn't love.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's God saying, this is the boundary I've drawn because you've been acting in disobedience. Not all the time. I don't want to, that's not a blanket statement. Sometimes we just live in a broken world. But there are times that the reason why we haven't experienced the joys of that relationship is because we have been the abuser in that relationship towards God, and he still loves us. And so, he's saying that we need to have faith in his ability and his love to be able to walk in wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I read this, like I said, I know that my background does influence my interpretation of this very much.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm seeing it. And I think maybe this is why it's so important to have so many people reading the Bible, bringing their own perspective and own filters to it, because I don't think somebody who had been in a whole functioning relationship would have seen these codependent, abusive themes between Israel and God and Jephthah and the Gileadites.
That makes sense. And really, I mean, I like what you said about having more people coming and bringing what they see to it, because there is, of course, the rabbis applied this to the Torah, but that it's like a diamond with 70 faces,
right?
Where we are, and you can apply that, I think, to the entirety of the Bible, and even in a lot of stories in general, that where you can read it one way and get something else out of it that someone else would not.
Oh yeah. Well, as I'm reading this, and I'm like going, it would have been so good for me when I was looking at the proper response to my abuser was, if I could have said, here's how God handled it.
Right.
And so I know this is the right way to handle it. And that I don't have to accept an apology. That's the other big thing is I didn't have to accept oh, look at me, honey, I'm doing better now. Well,
I mean, you've mentioned before the whole forgive and forget thing,
right?
And there is, I think we tend to, especially in marriages where there is an abusive situation, I do feel like we hold that over people's heads with forgive and forget, or if someone comes to you and asks forgiveness, forgive them 7 times, 70 times. But
right.
I do think at some point we have to make that distinction between what is actually an apology with repentance and what is the formula apology to get what you want.
Well,
and I think that's why we, it's kind of interesting right now. There's a big movement against the sinner's prayer movement,
right.
And whatever, I think to me it's the same as creeds. Really, it's a guideline to talk
right.
about forgiveness and what repentance means, and I think we do have to look. I mean, we don't have to because we can't, but God looks at the heart of the people who are turning to him. And I think that, it's not the prayer that saves you.
Right.
It's whether or not you have a repentant heart. And I do think that the reason that God put that criteria there, that it is the repentant heart, is because that's not actually, it's not something you can fake.
Well, if it was just the right words, then we're just casting a spell.
Right.
And that's the thing, that's the difference. God he is relational. And honestly, that's where he's got it over somebody who's in an abusive relationship, because he did look at their hearts and he says, no, I see what you're doing. You're using me because I am a faithful God, but you don't remain faithful to me. And so that's whenever I started bringing in the marriage analogy, that's one of the things that a lot of people have a hard time trying to discern is, when do I say enough's enough? And God did say, hey, I don't have to accept an apology and act like everything's okay. And I think that's one of the things that we do have to pray for wisdom and discernment. And, we need faithful counselors in that to help us determine whether or not the apology is sincere, whether we should draw that line. But for me, just to see this was like, I know there's somebody out there who's going to go, I needed to hear that. And, and it doesn't just have to be marriage. It can be,
friendships, parents,
kids even.
Kids, yeah.
It's painful. And I'm not saying that it didn't hurt God to set that boundary. I think the text reflects that. And sometimes doing the right thing doesn't always feel good.
Right.
And I think the fact that we can see God saying this is the right move, but he's still hurt over it, that should encourage us that we're not alone, and that this isn't something that's just unique to us. And so that God does join in with us in these relational issues. So it kind of surprised me when I read through this. I did not expect to see that in this story.
Sure. Yeah.
And,
it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I know this is the part of the story that a lot of people skim through real quick because they want to get to the more exciting part, but we'll be getting to that probably next week.
Yeah. Sounds good. Would you have anything else, or is that the end of your notes?
That's it.
Notes.
We're
Okay.
out.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us. We're glad to have you. Feel free to be part of the conversation. Hit us up over at Raven Creek SC on all social media, ravencreeksc.com. Get you to the website where there are blog posts, companion pieces, show notes, and some other things. One other thing I do want to draw your attention to, there is a little button on the bottom that says support. If you click that link, you can feel free to visit our Patreon page. We do have some perks there. I actually redid some of the perks. Nobody lost anything, but I did make some of the other tiers a little more accessible if you don't want to spend quite as much to help us out. If you do want to help us out, we do encourage you to only give, not as you would to your church, just this is kind of an extra thing. I don't want to...
Right. We don't take away from
elevate ourselves that, be sure you're doing, give as you see fit. And if you don't want to give money, please share this and write us a review, comment, because that does help us get found by people who are looking for theology podcast. And we definitely want people to find us and hopefully benefit from some of the material that we've been able to gather.
Absolutely.
So, thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.